What would you do if, after decades of marriage, a shocking secret emerged that changed everything you thought you knew about your spouse? This is a story of love, betrayal, and a breathtaking discovery that left everyone speechless. Stay with us. This tale takes an unexpected turn no one could have predicted. Barbara and Richard Thompson were the kind of couple you read about in romance novels. After 40 years of marriage, they seemed to embody the ideal partnership. Their days unfolded with the quiet joys of retirement, long walks on the beach, gardening in their sunlit backyard, and weekly bridge games with friends. Barbara, a retired schoolteacher, exuded warmth, making everyone feel at home. Richard, a meticulous former accountant, ensured everything ran smoothly. With 2 grown children and a grandchild on the way, their family adored them. However, beneath the surface of their idyllic life, cracks were beginning to form. It began with Richard's restlessness. Barbara noticed that he was spending more time away from home, early morning jogs that stretched for hours and frequent trips to the library, yet he never brought back a book when she inquired about it. "I'm just trying to stay active," he would smile, but Barbara wanted to believe him. After all, they had built a life based on trust. Still, something felt off. Simultaneously, she too started to withdraw. Joining a local painting class, a dream she had long cherished, pulled her out of her comfort zone. One day, as she tidied their kitchen, Barbara noticed Richard's phone buzzing on the counter. A name she didn't recognize lit up the screen: Amanda. Her stomach tightened, but she quickly dismissed her unease, convincing herself that she was being paranoid. Unbeknownst to Richard, Barbara had her own reasons for guilt. During her painting class, she had formed a bond with a charismatic man named Paul, whose endless compliments and humor made her feel alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Their interactions began innocently enough. Paul would linger after class, offering advice and encouraging her creativity. Slowly, they delved into personal topics, sharing stories and emotions over coffee after class. One rainy afternoon, they found themselves alone in the cozy cafe that had become their sanctuary. "I feel distant from Richard," Barbara confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's just a phase," Paul suggested, his tone gentle. Barbara studied his face, seeking comfort but feeling a flicker of doubt about her relationship with Paul. Meanwhile, Richard's behavior grew more secretive. He locked his phone, left the house without explanation, and concocted excuses to cancel plans. As symptoms of their precarious situation multiplied, Barbara avoided confronting him, instead focusing on her friendship with Paul, rationalizing it as harmless. Their lives were on a collision course, unknowingly trapped in a web of deceit. The turning point arrived on a Saturday morning while Barbara tidied their bedroom. She found a receipt tucked into Richard's jacket pocket, one from an upscale restaurant in the next town, a place they had never visited together. Her heart raced as the clues came together: the locked phone, the long absences, the name Amanda. Richard was having an affair. Instead of confronting him, Barbara chose to investigate further. She confided in her best friend Linda, and together they devised a plan. When Richard next left the house without explanation, Barbara followed him, heart pounding as she watched him greet a woman and embrace her. Anger and anguish surged within her, fueling thoughts of how long this had been going on, who the woman was, and if their marriage had been a lie. Yet she didn't confront Richard. Instead, she sent a message to Paul: "Hey, I need to talk." As Barbara grappled with her emotions, Richard faced his own complexities. The truth about Amanda was far more intricate than it appeared, and Barbara's decision to meet Paul would precipitate a chain reaction that would shatter the foundation of their marriage. The next day, she met Paul at their usual cafe. The rain outside mirrored the storm brewing in her heart. Then Paul walked in, his warm smile offering fleeting comfort. "Barbara," he said, sensing her change in demeanor. Her voice trembled as she leaned in, whispering, "I think Richard is having an affair." Paul's brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure?" he pressed, waiting for her to elaborate. With shaking hands, Barbara recounted the distant behavior, the locked phone, the mysterious receipts, and the unsettling scene at the hotel. Her words poured out, a tumultuous mix of anger and heartache, revealing the profound emotional turmoil she faced. Paul listened intently, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry, Barbara. You don't deserve this," he said, his words wrapped around her wounded heart like a soothing balm. For a fleeting moment, Barbara envisioned a life where she didn't have to vie for someone's attention, a life in which she truly felt seen. Meanwhile, across town at the boutique hotel, Richard was meeting Amanda in the cozy lounge. She handed him a folder filled with old photographs, documents, and letters. "You need to tell her," Amanda urged, her voice laced with frustration. "Richard, I can't. Not yet. This isn't just about me. Barbara has a right to know." Her tone softened as she placed a hand on his arm. "She's going to find out eventually, right? Wouldn't you rather it come from you?" He sighed heavily, staring at the folder that weighed down his conscience. "You're right. I'll tell her soon," Richard conceded. That evening, the tension in the room was palpable as Barbara and Richard sat down for dinner. Clenching her fork, Barbara finally looked Richard square in the eye. He froze, his hand hovering over his glass of wine. Quickly composing himself, he masked the panic in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" he replied, feigning ignorance. "I followed you," Barbara declared firmly. "I saw you meet her at the hotel. Don't lie to me." Richard's shoulders sagged as he set his glass down, caught between denial and the weight of the truth. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then explain it," Barbara demanded, her voice shaking as the realization deepened that her husband of 40 years might be cheating. Richard stood abruptly, motioning for her to follow him to the living room. He retrieved the same folder Amanda had given him earlier that day and handed it to her. "This is what I've been hiding," Richard said, his gaze averted. Barbara opened the folder, anger swiftly morphing into confusion as she sifted through its contents. Among the old black and white photographs was an image of a young woman, strikingly resembling Amanda, alongside handwritten letters, birth certificates, and medical records. "Who is this?" Barbara's voice trembled. Richard hesitated, his expression shifting with regret. "Amanda is my daughter, from before we met." Barbara's heart felt as though it had stopped. "What I was when I was young," Richard began, his tone heavy. "Her mother and I had a brief relationship. I didn't even know Amanda existed until a few months ago, when she reached out to me wanting to understand her origins." Barbara stared at him, emotions surging tumultuously inside her. "You've been sneaking around? Why didn't you tell me you were visiting?" I didn't know how to handle it. I was afraid of how you'd react, afraid of what it would mean for us. I didn't want to disrupt our lives." Barbara sank into the couch, the folder pressing against her chest like lead. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. Instead, you let me believe you were having an affair." "I'm sorry, Barbara. I didn't mean to." "Hurt me?" she interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "It's not just about the secret, Richard. It's about how we've grown distant. We've been living separate lives for years." Richard reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I need time to process this." That night, Barbara lay awake, staring out at the rain-soaked street. The revelation about Amanda shocked her, but it wasn't the root of her anguish. The real issue lay in the emotional chasm that had widened between her and Richard, one neither had noticed until it was nearly too late. Her thoughts wandered to Paul, whose presence had been a reminder of what it felt like to be treasured. But was she truly ready to abandon a lifetime with Richard for the allure of something new? The next day, Barbara made the decision to meet Amanda. They arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe, where Barbara found herself face to face with the woman she had assumed was Richard's mistress. To her surprise, Amanda was warm and articulate, her nervousness mirroring Barbara's own turmoil as she considered her relationship with Richard. "I didn't mean to cause problems between you and Richard," Amanda said earnestly. "I just wanted to know my father." Barbara studied Amanda's features, noting the subtle resemblance to Richard. "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" she inquired. "I had no idea until my mother died," Amanda replied. "I found some old letters, and when I finally contacted him, I didn't expect him to want a relationship, but he did." Barbara nodded slowly, feeling her anger dissipate. Amanda wasn't the enemy, she was simply a fragment of Richard's past that had come to shatter their carefully constructed present. Richard kept another secret from his past, a truth he had never summoned the courage to share. As Barbara left the cafe, a whirlwind of emotions surged within her, confusion, anger, and an unexpected sense of empathy. The revelation about Amanda had altered the fabric of their lives, yet it left unanswered the more profound question: could she and Richard navigate their way back to each other, or had the damage already been irreparable? Driving home, Barbara grappled with her feelings, pondering whether she was ready to fight for her marriage or if it was time to start anew. Returning from her meeting with Amanda, Barbara's mind spun with uncertainty. For years, she had believed that her life with Richard was free of secrets. Now the stark reality dawned on her: their marriage was far from unblemished. Richard was in the living room when she entered, his face lined with worry, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Did you meet her?" he asked, his voice tight. "I did," Barbara replied, placing her purse down. "She's lovely, and she's your daughter." Richard inhaled sharply, realization flooding his features. "I see that now," he exhaled, relief mingled with dread. But Barbara's next words struck him hard. "That doesn't erase what you've done, Richard. I know I've hurt you." He stepped closer, wanting to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "I know I've hurt you too, but we can fix this. I want to fix this." "I don't want to fix this, Richard. I need to be honest with you. You've been hiding from me, not just from Amanda, but from everything. When was the last time we really shared our truths?" "You didn't trust me." "She's your daughter, Richard. I understand that now." Richard felt the weight of her words, but they seemed to deepen the chasm between them. "I want to mend this," he said earnestly. Barbara shook her head, frustration bubbling over. "You've been avoiding the truth, Richard. When was the last time we were truly honest with each other? We haven't been a real marriage, we've just been two people sharing a space." In the days that followed, Barbara increasingly leaned on Paul, surprising herself with her dependence on him. At their next coffee meeting, she could see the concern etched across his brow. "You've been through a lot," Paul said gently. "It's understandable to feel lost. Can you trust Richard again?" Barbara sighed, her heart heavy. "It's more than just Amanda. It's the years of distance between us, the way we've drifted apart." Paul reached across the table, his hand lightly touching hers. "You deserve to feel loved and appreciated. If Richard can't provide that, maybe it's time to consider what truly makes you happy." His words resonated deeply, causing her heart to ache, not because they were untrue, but because they revealed a painful clarity. For the first time in decades, Barbara contemplated life without Richard. Meanwhile, Richard wrestled with his own guilt following his daughter's encouragement to fight for his marriage. Taking her advice to heart, he began with small gestures, cooking dinner, leaving notes for Barbara, and striving to engage her in deeper conversations. One evening, he found her in the garden tending to her roses. "Do you remember when we planted these together?" he asked softly, hoping to spark a moment of shared memory amid the growing distance. He crouched beside her, looking for a connection. Barbara glanced at him, her expression guarded. "It was after our first big fight. You said they'd be a symbol of fresh starts." Richard nodded, wrestling with his own guilt. Amanda had urged him to fight for his marriage, and he took her advice to heart. He began making small gestures, cooking dinners, leaving notes for Barbara, and attempting to engage her in meaningful conversations. One evening, he found Barbara in the garden tending to her roses. "Do you remember when we planted these?" he asked softly, crouching beside her. Her hands paused over the soil. "Fresh starts only work if both people are willing to put in the effort." "Are you?" He spoke firmly, but needed reassurance of her willingness as well. A week later, Amanda invited Barbara and Richard to her home for dinner, hoping to introduce them to her family, her husband, Michael, and their two young children. Barbara hesitated, unsure whether she was ready to face the reality of Richard's extended family. Yet she agreed, realizing that meeting Amanda's family could provide clarity for her own future. At dinner, Barbara was struck by Amanda's warmth and her children's joyful energy. Watching Richard interact with his grandchildren stirred unexpected emotions within her. He was so natural and attentive, a side of him she hadn't seen in years. As dessert was served, Michael raised a toast to new beginnings. He smiled at Amanda and Richard, while Barbara clinked her glass with the others, feeling a mix of hope and trepidation. Was this a new beginning for her and Richard, or the end of their chapter? That night, Barbara sat in her bedroom, staring at the framed photos on the dresser. Each image, from their wedding day to family vacations, told a story of love, resilience, and shared history. But was history enough to sustain their marriage? The next morning, she met Richard at the kitchen table. He looked up, his eyes heavy with worry. "Have you made a decision?" he asked. Barbara took a deep breath. "Yes, I need space. I need time to figure out what I want, who I am outside of this marriage." Richard's face fell, but he nodded. "If that's what you need, I'll respect it. Though I hope you'll find your way back to me." In the weeks that followed, Barbara began exploring life on her own. She took art classes, traveled with friends, and even attended a retreat for women rediscovering themselves after major life changes. She found joy in small moments, walking through a museum, trying new recipes, and reconnecting with old friends. Paul was a supportive presence, yet Barbara kept their relationship platonic. She wasn't ready to embrace anything new while still unraveling her feelings for Richard. Meanwhile, Richard made changes of his own. He volunteered at a local community center and began therapy to confront the fears and insecurities that had caused him to hide Amanda from Barbara. He also focused on rebuilding his relationship with Amanda, forming a bond that was both healing and redemptive. One evening, Barbara returned home to find a letter from Richard on the kitchen table. It wasn't a plea for her to come back. Rather, it was a heartfelt reflection on their life together, their challenges, and his hopes for the future. "I want you to be happy, Barbara," the letter concluded. "Whether that's with me or not, I just want you to know that I'll always cherish what we had." Tears filled Barbara's eyes as she read the letter for the first time. She saw Richard differently now, not as the man who had disappointed her, but as someone who was genuinely trying to change. As she folded the letter, she recognized that her journey wasn't over. Yet she faced a pivotal choice that would define the rest of her life. Sitting on her porch, the golden glow of the evening sun washed over the garden they had nurtured together over decades of marriage. For the first time in a long time, Barbara felt a flicker of hope. Memories flooded her mind, the laughter, the shared dreams, and the life they had built together. Despite the damage caused by secrets and distance, their marriage wasn't completely broken. She needed to decide if she was willing to try to mend it. A week later, Barbara invited Richard to meet her at their favorite park, a cherished spot from their children's younger years, steeped in memories. When Richard arrived, he looked nervous yet hopeful, a small bouquet of daisies, her favorite, in hand. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, presenting the flowers with a tentative smile. "I needed some time to think," she replied softly, "and I wanted to talk." They settled on a bench overlooking the lake, the gentle ripples mirroring the ebb and flow of their conversation. "I've been angry, Richard," Barbara began, her voice tinged with hurt, "but I know we've both made mistakes. I wasn't always present either. I let us drift apart." Richard nodded solemnly. "I understand. I take responsibility for my part. I should have been honest with you about Amanda from the start. My fear got in the way." Barbara sighed. "What I need to know now is whether we can move forward, not as the people we were, but as who we are now." Richard hesitated, then spoke earnestly. "I want to try, but only if you do. I don't want to pressure you, I just want you to be happy." They agreed to take things slow, starting with weekly dinners at home. Barbara insisted on honesty, and Richard promised transparency about his thoughts and feelings. At first, their conversations felt awkward, like they were learning to communicate anew, but gradually the barriers began to crumble. One evening, Richard surprised Barbara by whisking her away to a painting class. "I know how much this means to you," he said shyly. "I thought it might be something we could share." Touched by the gesture, Barbara enjoyed the class, laughing at their clumsy attempts to recreate the instructor's designs. With each week, their dinners became a platform for deeper connection. They were discovering each other again, the lightness returning to their relationship. Unexpectedly, Amanda also played a role in their healing. She began inviting Barbara and Richard to family dinners, revealing a side of Richard that Barbara had longed to see again, the patient, attentive father. One evening, as they helped Amanda clean up after a meal, she pulled Barbara aside. "I hope you know how much he loves you," Amanda said earnestly. "He talks about you all the time. He really is trying, Barbara." Barbara smiled, her heart softening. "I can see that, and I appreciate it." As she and Richard rekindled their connection, Barbara realized she needed to close the chapter with Paul. Meeting him at the cafe where they had shared countless conversations, it was time to confront that part of her life head-on. Her heart heavy yet resolute, Barbara began, "Paul, I owe you so much. You were there for me when I felt lost, and I'm always grateful for that." Paul's expression softened, though a flicker of something lingered in his eyes. "Hey, are you trying to get back together?" "Yeah, we're giving it a shot," she replied, gauging his reaction. Barbara smiled gently. "I see. I appreciate that. But you know we have to keep talking." "I know. And I hope you understand. I just want us to be happy. I truly wish you all the happiness in the world. I appreciate that, and I hope you find your happiness too. Regardless, we must move on. I'm sorry, but I think it's for the best." They parted on good terms. While Barbara felt a pang of sadness, it was also a moment of closure, occurring on what would have been their 41st wedding anniversary. Richard had surprised her with a dinner in the garden they had planted together. Fairy lights danced from the trees, illuminating the table set with their favorite dishes. As they ate, Richard took her hand gently. "I know we can't go back to the way things were," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I want to build something new with you, something stronger, something real. Will you give me that chance?" Tears welled in Barbara's eyes. "I want that too," she replied softly, "but we need to promise each other that we'll keep communicating, be honest with one another, no matter what." Richard nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. "I promise." The next day, they began making plans, not just for themselves, but for their family. They hosted a barbecue for Amanda, her family, and their other children, bringing everyone together for the first time. Barbara watched as Richard played with their grandchildren, laughter echoing through the yard. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Their marriage wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it felt real. Standing beside Richard, she realized that was enough. However, just as they believed they had reached a new equilibrium, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to both of them and written in a shaky hand. The return address was from someone they hadn't seen in decades, Richard's first love, Amanda's mother. "Dear Barbara and Richard," the letter began, "I have something to tell you, something I should have disclosed a long time ago." Barbara's mind raced. What could possibly be left to uncover? She sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. Richard stood behind her, brow furrowed in confusion. "What does it say?" he murmured, his voice low with concern. "It's from Amanda's mother," Barbara replied softly. "She says there's something we need to know about the past." Richard's face drained of color. What could she possibly mean? Barbara handed him the letter, her heart pounding as he began to read. It revealed a long-hidden truth about Amanda's parentage. While Margaret had always believed Richard was Amanda's father, recent health issues had prompted genetic testing. The results had confirmed a shocking revelation. Amanda's biological father was someone else entirely, a man Margaret had briefly dated before meeting Richard. "I should have told you years ago," the letter began, "but I was scared, and you were so." She might have said, "Hey, Richard, there's something we need to talk about." As Richard unfolded the letter, he learned that Amanda's mother, Margaret, had uncovered a long-hidden truth. Margaret believed Richard was Amanda's father, but following health complications, a genetic test revealed otherwise. Amanda's real father was someone Margaret had briefly dated before meeting Richard. "I should have told you sooner," the letter continued. "I was scared, and you were so kind." Richard set the letter down, trembling hands resting in his lap. "She's not my daughter," he whispered, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. Barbara gently took his hand, feeling her heart ache at the sorrow in his voice. "Richard, this doesn't change what you've built with Amanda. She's still family." Richard nodded slowly, pain clouding his eyes. "I've loved her as my own since the moment I met her. That doesn't change, but I don't know how to tell her." The following day, they invited Amanda over. The living room felt heavy with tension as Richard gripped the letter, his knuckles turning white. "Amanda," he began, voice trembling, "there's something we need to talk about. It's about your mother and me." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" Richard handed her the letter, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Amanda read in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. When she finished, she looked up, voice quaking. "You're saying you're not my father?" Richard leaned forward, urgency in his tone. "I didn't know, Amanda. I thought I was, and I still feel like I am, no matter what that letter says." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she reached out and grasped Richard's hand. "You've always been my dad." "This doesn't change that." Barbara watched the exchange, her emotions swirling. She felt deep respect for Amanda's grace and Richard's unwavering love. In the weeks that followed, Amanda reached out to Margaret's family to learn about her biological father. Although he had passed away years earlier, she connected with some relatives, finding comfort in the understanding. The revelation shook Amanda, but she remained resolute. "You've always been my dad," she reassured Richard, the bond of love continuing to thrive. Barbara and Richard supported her through this journey, attending family gatherings and encouraging her to embrace this new aspect of her identity. The unexpected revelation drew Barbara and Richard closer, their shared love for Amanda uniting them in profound ways. One evening, sitting together on the porch, Richard took Barbara's hand and said, "I don't know what I would have done without you through all of this." Barbara smiled back at him, her eyes shimmering with emotion.